regular viewers of my channel will know that I have sort of a heightened sensitivity to things like anti-Semitism. It's not that I'm extra offended by it, I'm just more like better able to like detect it. Well, last week, some uncomfortable information came out. I found it trending on Twitter, and it's apparently that about 2/3 of Millennials and Gen Z are not aware that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. A number of studies conducted in 2018 and 2019 were published, and they found that these numbers are not good. And since I've made, this video about it, I felt the need to comment on it in some way. And just so you know, this video is not scripted, so please forgive me, but I have some information to tell you guys. So 2 major research projects were published on this. One from the Schoen Consulting Institute, and then another from Pew Research Center. And they found some uncomfortable numbers. So in Pew's study, they gave basically a set of 4 multiple choice questions and measured people's sort of Holocaust knowledge based on those 4 questions. Among these questions, of course, were knowledge about how many people were killed in the Holocaust, how Hitler came to power, and a couple others. And given these 4 questions, they measured how different demographic groups were better or less able to answer the 4 questions. And so what they found was that Jews and non-religious people had the highest scores, usually getting about at least 3 out of 4 of the questions right. Next came white Christians, who were usually able to get about half of the questions right. The worst scoring, and probably the most politically contentious, would be black Protestants typically only got 1 in 4 or fewer questions right. That last one may sound concerning, but it's also not surprising if you're aware of the wider trends. Like, I have a whole other video about this kind of thing that's related to it. There are some other characteristics that seem to be associated with being more knowledgeable about the Holocaust and answering these 4 questions, such as personally knowing a Jewish person made you more likely to answer at least 1 additional question correctly. When it came to political aptitude for these questions, Republicans and Democrats were about equal, with Republicans being able to answer slightly more questions on the whole. And of course there is some correlation between, age and knowledge about the Holocaust, which seems pretty obvious. Teenagers know the least, people over 65 tend to know the most. However, what they did find is that teens tended to know about the same amount about the Holocaust as uneducated adults. Here are some stats from the Schoen Consulting Group. They said about 70% of the people interviewed for their study say that fewer people care about the Holocaust now. And 58% say that something like the Holocaust could happen again. And according to this, 11% of all US adults, and when you zoom that down into millennials, 20% of millennials either haven't heard of the Holocaust or are not sure if they have heard of it. And almost as concerning, about 1 in 3 Americans and about 41% of millennials believe that 2 million or fewer Jews were killed in the Holocaust. A big question around this is now, is this just ignorance, a bad educational system not doing its job? Or is this an actual rise in anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial? Back when I made Appropriating Legitimacy, my video about the history of Holocaust denial, I did not include a segment on the state of Holocaust education in the US or around the world because I didn't think the numbers were that bad. At least these numbers weren't available yet, so I didn't know. And so I didn't include it because I didn't think it was a huge problem. I assumed most people knew about the Holocaust, and even according to these studies, most people know. It's just their actual detailed knowledge about it tends to be limited. There's also an issue that me and other educational types on YouTube will probably have a little more difficulty coming to understand, is the fact that we think these numbers might sound crazy because we know about it. I mean, I'm a history buff. I have a degree in history. I've made videos about Holocaust denial, anti-Semitism, and the history of the Jews. So I'm quite familiar with the Holocaust and the number of victims. But then you have to think, well, okay, I'm probably an outlier here, because when I hear millennials doing this, it seems kind of odd that millennials be knowledgeable. I mean, I'm a millennial. I'm aware of these things. The numbers couldn't be that bad, could they? But then again, I'm probably the wrong person to interview about this. The fact of the matter is, I am not the average millennial. I am a history guy. I take it upon myself to learn these things. But fact of the matter is, your average millennial or just American in general doesn't need to know how many Jews died in the Holocaust in their everyday life. You know, I mean, you're working a cash register or you're doing whatever jobs millennials have now, and you probably don't need to know that number for your work. So you don't really keep it. Of course, you also don't need to keep a bunch of Rick and Morty lore in your head, and yet plenty of millennials are able to do that successfully. And so this leads me to thinking, how bad was my education about the Holocaust? I mean, I know plenty of it, but I tend to think that, well, I probably learned most of that on my own. Now that I think back on my education, I don't think, at least in my K through 12 education, that there was too much dedication to the Holocaust. I mean, all the students knew that it happened, and you usually covered the Holocaust whenever you studied World War II. And so here in California public schools, you would usually end up covering that when you take world history or European history during your sophomore year of high school, and then you'd learn about it a bit again in your junior year when you're taking U.S. history. However, in both those circumstances, Holocaust education is a segment of World War II stuff, not a thing in and of itself. And they probably mentioned the number of people killed, but once again, if the lessons aren't dedicated to the Holocaust, it's going to be harder to make that sink in. So you got to wonder, okay, why isn't there better Holocaust education in the U.S.? Well, I think for one reason why is that older generations, like Gen X and older, are probably operating under an assumption that you don't need to be formally educated in it because you're gonna learn about it through sort of cultural osmosis. And I can't say that that's an entirely incorrect thing. I mean, there are plenty of references to Nazis in popular media. They are a very popular subject to cover. You go to your average bookstore and you'll find tons of books about the Nazis. And if you're going to talk about Nazis, the Holocaust is going to come up. Or there's the History Channel, which until the late 2000s was very much obsessed with the Nazis. And so that's why the History Channel was at one point sort of derisively called the Hitler Channel because of its obsession with World War II documentaries. If you're going to have that much World War II documentary going on, there's probably going to be plenty of references to the Holocaust. And so you got to think, okay, there's no shortage of means of learning about the Holocaust. How can this be? How can there be such bad knowledge among young people when there's so many options? Well, of course, over the last decade, the History Channel has lessened the amount of World War II docs it plays and more about the reality shows and all the other dead horses that I didn't take the time to kick in my video about that. There are other possibilities that I could toy around in my head about why maybe millennials and younger people don't take Holocaust denial, or at least don't take knowledge of the Holocaust more seriously. Maybe it's because, like, we throw the word Nazi around too much. I mean, every time you want to label your political opponent as a bad guy, you just call them a Nazi. And suddenly you do that and you don't have to, address their actual argument. You can just say, you're a big, bad, racist Nazi, and I don't have to address what you're saying. And by doing that, you kind of make the power of the Nazi word lose its power. Me and a bunch of other people said this around 2016, where, it's like you're constantly calling people Nazis, and it's going to have something of a, boy who cried wolf effect, If you keep calling people Nazis, they're going to take it less seriously. You use it too much and the word loses its power. Republicans and conservatives have had to learn this lesson the hard way themselves, and to an extent they still haven't learned it, that by calling everyone you disagree with a socialist or a commie, you're going to begin to lose the power of that word. And nowadays, there's a 50-50 chance that if you call someone that, they will actively agree with it, which is different than the Nazi accusation, because if you call someone a Nazi, there's like a 99% chance they will deny that accusation. So we all still acknowledge that Nazis are bad, but we take the accusation less seriously because it gets overused. Now, is that a reason why Holocaust knowledge is so poor? I don't know. I can see a connection, but I can't be definitive about if that's actually a case or if that's just more of a correlation rather than a causation point. All of this has gotten me to think more about my Holocaust denial video. 75 minutes, a good chunk at the end is me just talking about how hard it is to do this kind of stuff on YouTube and whatnot. I have to think, should there be more in there? Because there's information I had at the time when making the video that I didn't include because it just didn't seem relevant or it slowed down the flow of the video. And there's also information I have acquired since then that I now look back on it and think, if I were making that video now, this stuff would definitely be included. And so I've been contemplating about whether or not I should remake that video. And I don't just mean add additional stuff on top of it. I've been thinking about rewriting it, refilming it, re-recording it, redoing everything in it, Because for A, I'm a better writer now than I was over a year ago when I first made that video. I'm also a better editor now than I was then, so I could definitely make something that was higher production quality. And of course, there's additional information that I would now want to include, including a chapter on the status of Holocaust education in the US in particular and around the world in general. That's kind of concerning. Politically motivated anti-Semitism is concerning. And of course, there have been a number of studies over the years now that show that anti-Semitism is on the rise in the US. And it's not just, right-wing anti-Semitism, it's like not just those alt-righters. There's lots of left-wing anti-Semitism as well. Because as it turns out, the political extremes, the extreme left and the extreme right, both have bad anti-Semitism habits. The difference is that everyone condemns the right-wing anti-Semitism, and rightfully so. But you don't hear nearly as many people condemning left-wing anti-Semitism, because left-wing anti-Semitism likes to disguise itself as just being anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, socialism, or whatever left-wing buzzwords they're going to attach to it. When fact of the matter is, movements like BDS are in fact anti-Semitic. This video has felt rambling toward the end, so I think I'm going to wrap things up here. So I guess I want to pose a question to you. If you guys, for those of you who have seen my Holocaust denial documentary, do you think I should remake it? Do you think I should make it, remake it, expand upon it, improve all the stuff with it? Or should I just leave it be and instead just make like addendums to that video? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I want to thank you all for taking the time to watch this rambly, unscripted video, and I hope the algorithm doesn't ding it because low effort videos tend to get punished. So, until next time, see you later.